Earlier, we spoke to Professor Seyed Marandi from the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran in Iran. We began by asking him how big and serious this round of sanctions are.
These sanctions have existed before. The United States has been sanctioning Iran since the beginning of the revolution. As pointed out earlier, the reason why the embassy takeover took place 40 years ago was that almost 40 years ago was that the embassy was conspiring to overthrow the revolution, and the U.S. government had given sanctuary to the Shah of Iran, who was a mass murderer, and the students thought that the United States would try to carry out a coup like in 1953. So the antagonism of the United States towards Iran is very long and ongoing. And under Obama, we had very similar sanctions to the ones that we have now. The difference, though, today is that Iran has already had extensive experience with sanctions, and also Trump has a much more difficult time in creating a coalition among his Western allies. So the belief in Tehran is that it will be tough for the next few months, but that gradually the effect of the sanctions will decrease. And as we've noticed in the past few weeks, there has been almost no movement at all with regards to the Iranian currency. The markets are normal. And today the currency actually gained a bit of strength against the U.S. dollar. So the psychological warfare that's being carried out by the United States against Iran over the past few months, especially through their Persian language media outlets like BBC Persian, like the VOA and other Western-funded outlets, that psychological warfare has been losing its impact.
Yeah, and some of America's allies have actually cautioned against these sanctions and are planning a sort of bailout method to protect Iran's interest. Is this likely to help Iran in any way?
Well, countries that have conflict with the United States, like the Chinese and the Russians, and who are also being sanctioned by the Americans, they're increasingly moving towards Iran because they see that these sanctions are a threat to their own interests. The Europeans are they're very easily let's say pushed aside by the Americans. They don't have much of a backbone, so the Iranians don't have a great deal of faith in the Europeans. They have, of course, lost a lot as a result of the sanctions. French and German companies especially have suffered heavily, and they know that the Chinese will replace them. So they are trying to resist the United States, but the Iranians are not counting that much on the Europeans. But I think the belief in Tehran is that Asian countries are showing a great deal more backbone than European countries, but still there is a growing rift between the United States and the EU.
And what's Tehran's countermeasures to these sanctions?
Well, the Iranian government is moving away from liberal economics, and they are spreading the social net to help support the more vulnerable. After all, the sanctions, the intention is to make people suffer. Trump calls them brutal sanctions, just like Obama called them crippling sanctions. In other words, Obama and Trump both wanted ordinary Iranians to suffer as much as possible. It's in the civilized world, this would seem unacceptable, but you know, we live in a very upside-down world. But in any case, I think that in addition to that, the Iranians are also planning on developing ties further with countries that are facing American antagonism, like Russia and China as well. And Iran is building its regional ties, and they are using alternatives to the U.S. dollar. So Iranian trade now with Turkey is in rials and lira. With the Iraqis, they're again using the Iraqi and Iranian currency. The yuan is becoming increasingly important for Iran. So gradually, the Iranians are moving away from the U.S. dollar completely and using a basket of currencies as an alternative.
Interestingly, Professor, you just mentioned that Iran is now trying to engage some of the countries which are facing American antagonism. So what then is the risk of such big multinational firms, risking their reputations by directly trading with Iran? For instance, Total has announced that it's pulling out of Iran.
Yes, but what Iran is doing in response is that they are empowering local Iranian companies that have been active over the past few decades, because we have to keep in mind that these are not the first sanctions to be imposed against the country. In fact, Iran has one of the most advanced military industries in the world, and it is basically as a result of sanctions. Iran, before the revolution, had no military industry, but because the United States sanctioned Iran, and so did Western countries, and they supported Saddam Hussein, Iran was forced to create a military industry. And in the oil industry, we now see that there are many Iranian companies that are involved, and they have grown as a result of sanctions. So local Iranian companies, as well as smaller companies that are not directly linked to the U.S. economy, they too are increasingly being encouraged to come to Iran. Many Chinese companies have shown a great deal of interest to buy Iranian oil, as well as to invest in Iranian oil and gas companies. So the major companies that have strong links with the United States, some of them are no longer involved in Iran, but smaller companies, as well as the Iranian companies, have replaced them. But we have to keep in mind that many of these major companies really never did invest in Iran. Total, for example, they signed a contract, but they never actually did anything because they were constantly under American pressure. So the Iranians are sort of used to this, the current status quo.
So having said that, Professor, do you believe that these firms using middlemen, because I do get reports that some of these firms are now using middlemen to mobilize the special purpose vehicle on their behalf, do you think that will help counter the threat of possible sanctions by Washington?
Well, there are a host of different mechanisms. For example, with regards to oil, Iran is now selling oil on a special market to the private sector for both Iranians and non-Iranians. People can purchase Iranian oil directly. Also, they're using the Shanghai Bourse, or the Shanghai oil market, or the Shanghai oil exchange. And they're also selling oil, as you pointed out, to people on the high seas, as it were, in addition to the oil that they're selling, as usual, to partners like China, India, and other such countries, Korea and Japan. For the time being, they've received waivers from the United States